There is a moment, and most people have lived it without recognizing it for what it truly was, where everything you thought you controlled reveals itself to be an illusion. It happens quietly. A decision made in anger. A habit that returned after you swore it was gone. A voice inside you that you could not silence, no matter how loud you made the world around you. In that moment, the ancient Japanese already knew what you were discovering. That the greatest battlefield is not outside you. It never was. Miyamoto Musashi, the most celebrated swordsman in Japanese history, won over 60 duels against the finest warriors of his era. He was never defeated. And yet, when he was old and living alone in a cave on Mount Iwato, carving wood and writing philosophy, he did not speak of his opponents. He spoke of himself. He said, "The primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Whenever you parry, hit, spring, strike, or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this." But deeper than any sword technique, Musashi understood something that most men never learn in a lifetime. That the enemy most worthy of your discipline is the one who lives behind your eyes. This is not a video about samurai movies or historical warfare. This is a precise, philosophical instruction in the ancient Japanese art of self-governance. What the samurai called inner mastery applied directly to the life you are living right now. If you stay through to the end, something in the way you see yourself will shift. Not because of motivation. Motivation is temporary. What you are about to receive is older and more durable than motivation. It is understanding. And understanding, once it enters a man, does not leave him. Chapter 1. The man who could not hold still his name, for the purposes of this teaching, is Kenji. He is not a samurai. He is a 34-year-old man living in a modern city, working a demanding job, raising a young child, and carrying within him a low and persistent feeling that he cannot quite name. It is not sadness exactly. It is not failure. It is something closer to a gap, a space between who he knows himself capable of being and who he actually is when the day is done and the lights are out. Most people who feel this gap fill it with noise. Kenji fills it with screens, with food eaten too late, with scrolling through the lives of strangers, with the particular exhaustion that comes not from working hard but from never being fully present in anything. He is not an unusual man. He is, in fact, a precise portrait of what happens when a human being, regardless of intelligence, regardless of intention, has never been taught to govern himself from the inside. His external life has structure. He shows up to work. He pays his bills. He loves his family in the ways that he knows how. But internally, Kenji is what the Japanese would call fuante, unstable. His mind moves without his permission. His emotions arrive unannounced and leave damage on their way out. His decisions are made not from a centered place of deliberate will, but from the shifting terrain of mood and impulse. He is, in the truest sense, not in command of himself. This is where we begin. Not with a moment of victory, but with a morning in February, when Kenji woke up at 5:30. As he had promised himself he would the night before, looked at the ceiling for exactly 4 minutes, and then turned off his alarm and went back to sleep. He did this not because he was tired. He did it because something in him, some governor, some deeper will, was not yet strong enough to override the pull of comfort. And in that small surrender, which he would barely remember by noon, something important was lost. Not the morning, not the hour of productivity. What was lost was a small but real piece of his own authority over himself. The ancient Japanese had a word for this erosion, shikaku. It means disqualification, not from an external competition, but from oneself. The idea is that every act of self-betrayal, every moment where you say you will do a thing and then do not do it, removes you slightly further from the person you are trying to become. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, like sediment, until one day a man looks in the mirror and does not fully recognize the face looking back at him. Not because of how he looks, but because of the distance between what he promised and what he delivered to himself, about himself, in the private chambers of his own discipline. Chapter 2. The Principle of the Empty Cup. There's a teaching that most people know in its simplified form. The Zen story of the master who pours tea into a cup that is already full. But few have sat with long enough to understand what it is truly asking of them. The story goes like this. A scholar visits a Zen master to ask about enlightenment. As they sit, the master begins to pour tea into the scholar's cup. The scholar watches as the tea reaches the brim, and then continues to pour as the tea spills over the table, onto the floor, wasting itself. The scholar finally cries out, "The cup is full. No more will go in." The master stops and says, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" This story is told constantly in the context of learning, but its deeper application, the one the samurai understood, is about self-governance. Because a man who cannot control himself is always operating from a full cup. He is full of his reactions, his habits, his moods, his automatic patterns. There is no room for deliberate choice because every available space is already occupied by what he has never chosen to examine. When Kenji went back to sleep that February morning, he was not making a decision. He was allowing a pre-existing pattern to make the decision for him. The cup of his undisciplined self was full, and it poured in the direction of least resistance, as full cups always do. The samurai, trained in Zen from the time they were boys, were taught to empty themselves before every significant action. Before a duel, a warrior did not strategize in the frantic, anxious way of a fearful mind. He sat, he breathed, he removed himself from the equation until what remained was not Kenji, not the warrior's personal history, not his fears or his pride, but pure, undisturbed attention. This is what Musashi called the void in the final book of the Book of Five Rings. He described it not as emptiness in the nihilistic sense, but as the state in which a mind that is no longer cluttered by self-interference becomes capable of perfect action. Not perfect in the sense of flawless, perfect in the sense of true, aligned, clear, arising from center rather than from chaos. The practical question that this raises, and the samurai were always concerned with the practical above all, is this. How does a man empty a cup that has been filling for decades? How does Kenji, who has spent 34 years accumulating reactions, impulses, and unconscious patterns, begin to create space inside himself for something more deliberate? The answer the ancient Japanese gave was not what most people expect. They did not say, "Feel more." They did not say, "Think better thoughts." They said, "Begin with the body," because the body is the first kingdom, and a man who cannot govern his body cannot govern anything else. Chapter 3. The Body as the First Kingdom. The samurai did not separate the physical from the philosophical. This is a distinctly modern error. The tendency to treat the body as a vehicle for the mind, as though discipline of thought can exist independently of discipline of flesh. The ancient Japanese warrior tradition understood that the body and the mind are not two things in a hierarchy. They are one thing, expressed differently. When the samurai trained in kenjutsu, the art of the sword, they were not merely developing a physical skill. They were using the physical as a gateway to the philosophical. Every repetition of a cut, every hour of uncomfortable stillness, every training session continued past the point of desire. Each of these was simultaneously a philosophical act, a declaration, a small and serious statement of who was in command. Kenji, like most modern people, had separated these things entirely. He read books about discipline, while eating food he had already decided not to eat. He held strong philosophical opinions about focus and presence, while spending most of his waking hours fragmented across a dozen half-attended tasks. He understood, conceptually, a great deal about self-improvement. But understanding and embodiment are not the same thing. The samurai would have said that Kenji's philosophy lived only in his head, and a philosophy that lives only in the head is not a philosophy at all. It is decoration. True philosophy, in the Japanese tradition, must be lived in the body before it can be called real. The first practice the samurai gave their students was not meditation, as many assume. It was physical routine, specifically the establishment of a physical practice that was done every single day, regardless of mood, regardless of circumstances, regardless of desire. This is called keiko, which translates roughly as practice, but carries within it the nuance of something done repeatedly over time with full intention. The practice itself almost did not matter. What mattered was the act of showing up to it. A student who swept the dojo floor for an hour every morning before training was not learning to sweep. He was learning something infinitely more important, that his actions were not subject to the governance of his mood, that he could feel one way and do another, that the self who wanted comfort and the self who chose discipline were two different selves, and that he had the authority to decide which one would act. When Kenji's wife suggested one morning in March that he might benefit from waking up and going for a walk each morning, he agreed in the way people agree to things they have not yet committed to. He walked twice that week, skipped 3 days, walked once, and then quietly abandoned the practice without formally deciding to. This is not weakness in the conventional sense. It is the natural result of attempting a physical practice without understanding its philosophical purpose. The samurai did not walk each morning to improve their cardiovascular health. They did not train each morning to become stronger. They trained each morning to practice the act of being the kind of person who trains each morning. The external result was secondary. The internal declaration was primary. And it is this inversion, putting the declaration before the result, that most modern people never grasp and therefore never build the foundation of self-mastery that all other governance depends upon. Chapter 4. The Silence That Commands. There is a quality that every person who encountered Musashi described in the accounts left behind, and it is not what people expect. They do not describe ferocity. They do not describe the imposing physicality of a man who had survived 60 sword duels. The quality they describe consistently is silence. Not the absence of sound. Musashi spoke when speech was necessary, but an interior silence. A quality of being fully present and utterly unrushed. The sense, when in his company, that this man was not waiting for anything, not anxious about anything, not performing anything. He simply was. And this quality, which is so rare in human beings that it reads almost as supernatural when encountered, was not a gift. It was a practice. It was the product of decades of deliberate self-governance applied specifically to the domain of the mind. The Japanese term for this quality is mushin, empty mind or no mind. But the translation is misleading because mushin does not mean the absence of thought. It means the absence of unnecessary thought, the absence of self-generated interference. A warrior in the state of mushin still perceives. He still responds. But his responses arise from reality, from what is actually present, rather than from the stories he is telling himself about what is present. The difference between these two modes of operating is the difference between a mirror and a painting. A painting shows you what the artist decided to show you. A mirror shows you what is actually there. Kenji, by his own admission in a conversation with a colleague he trusted, said that he could not remember the last time his mind had been quiet. Not in a dramatic or suffering way. He said it almost as an observation, a mild curiosity about himself. He noticed that at dinner with his family, he was often thinking about work. At work, he was often thinking about dinner. In conversation, he was frequently preparing his response before the other person had finished speaking. In solitude, his mind generated noise to fill the space, as though silence itself had become something unfamiliar and therefore slightly threatening. This is the condition of a mind that has never been asked to govern itself in the domain of attention, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most consequential deficit a modern person can carry. The samurai practice for developing mushin was seated meditation, zazen, but the purpose was consistently misunderstood by those outside the tradition. People imagine that the goal of sitting in silence is to achieve a pleasant, peaceful mental state. This is not the goal. The goal is to practice witnessing the mind's activity without being commanded by it. When you sit in silence and a thought arises, and thoughts always arise, the practice is not to eliminate the thought. The practice is to notice that the thought arose, to notice that you are the one noticing it, and to return to stillness. This is repeated thousands of times in a single sitting. What is being trained is not the absence of thought. What is being trained is the gap between stimulus and response, the small but critical space in which a man can observe what is arising in him before that arising becomes action. This gap is where all self-governance lives, and for most people, it does not yet exist. Chapter 5. The Examined Enemy. Months passed for Kenji. He had begun tentatively to sit in silence each morning for 10 minutes before his family woke. He had not formally committed to this as a philosophical practice. He had simply begun doing it, initially, because he had no other choice. The house was quiet, and he had woken early, and sitting with his coffee felt less effortful than turning on a screen. But something was occurring in those 10 minutes that he could not yet name. He was beginning to see himself, not through the distorted lens of self-criticism or self-congratulation, but plainly, as the thing that existed, as a set of patterns and tendencies and recurring responses. He was beginning, for the first time in his adult life, to be in the same room as himself. In the samurai tradition, this is called knowing your enemy. But the enemy in question is not outside you. It is the unconsidered self, the patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior that operate without your awareness, and therefore without your consent. The ancient Japanese understood that a warrior who does not know his enemy will be defeated by him. And the most dangerous enemy of all is the one who lives inside you, who speaks in your voice, who claims your intentions, and who nevertheless acts against your deepest values at every available opportunity. This enemy is not your shadow in the poetic sense. It is simply your automaticity, the conditioned responses that have accumulated over a lifetime of living without examination. Kenji began to notice specific patterns. He noticed that when he felt criticized at work, something in him immediately moved toward either defense or withdrawal, never toward stillness and inquiry. He noticed that when his child needed attention during a moment when he was absorbed in something else, the feeling that arose in him was closer to resentment than love, even though he would never have admitted this or described himself as a resentful father. He noticed that he ate not when he was hungry, but when he was bored, and that this happened so automatically that the food was often half-eaten before he was aware he had begun. None of these were dramatic revelations. None of them required years of therapy to uncover. They required only 10 minutes of daily silence and the willingness to be honest about what appeared in that silence. Musashi wrote in his final text, the Dokodo, a set of 21 principles written 9 days before his death, the following: "Do not pursue pleasure for its own sake." This is often read as ascetic advice, but in the context of self-mastery, it carries a more precise instruction. Do not allow pleasure, comfort, and ease to become the governors of your behavior. Because a man who is governed by his pursuit of pleasure is not a man who is governing himself. He is a man being governed by sensation. And sensation, as the samurai well knew, is not qualified to lead. It has no strategic intelligence. It has no long-term vision. It knows only now. And the man who lives only now, not in the Zen sense of deliberate, chosen presence, but in the reactive sense of being perpetually available to whatever feels good, is a man whose life is not his own. Chapter 6. The Architecture of the Unbreakable Self. There is a concept in Japanese philosophy called kata, forms. Most people know this word from martial arts, where it refers to the choreographed sequences of movement that students practice repeatedly. But kata extends far beyond the dojo. In the samurai culture, the concept of kata described the predetermined structures within which a warrior organized his life. His morning routine was a kata. His manner of eating, his manner of addressing superiors, his manner of walking into a room, all of these were practiced, deliberate forms. Not because the samurai were rigid or performative, but because they understood something that modern life has largely forgotten. That structure is not the enemy of freedom. Structure is the condition that makes genuine freedom possible. This seems paradoxical until you examine it carefully. A man with no structure does not have freedom. He has chaos. His time is subject to the loudest demand. His energy goes where the most recent impulse directs it. His attention is available to anyone or anything that claims it. He is not free. He is simply unguided. The samurai kata were a declaration of what mattered, made concrete in behavior, repeated until the behavior became character. When a warrior knew exactly how he would begin his morning, what he would eat, when he would train, when he would be still, he removed these decisions from the domain of daily negotiation. He did not have to decide each morning whether to train. Training was a kata. It simply happened because it had always happened, because it was the architecture of who he was. Kenji, in his 10th week of morning silence, made a decision that surprised even him. He decided to stop negotiating with himself about certain things, not to use willpower. Willpower, as the samurai understood intuitively, and modern science has now confirmed, is a depleting resource, not a fixed capacity. Instead, he decided to remove decision from the equation entirely. He would walk for 30 minutes each morning, not if he felt like it, Not when the weather was agreeable. He would walk because walking was now what he did in the morning, the same way breakfast was what he did after walking, and silence was what he did before walking. These were not goals. They were not challenges. They were simply the shape of his morning. And the shape of a man's morning is, more than almost anything else, the shape of the man. The philosopher and swordsman Yagyu Munenori, who served as a sword instructor to the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century, wrote extensively about what he called the sword of no sword, the idea that true mastery renders the external instrument unnecessary, because the mastery has been so thoroughly internalized that it has become the master himself. The modern application of this principle is direct and practical. The man who has to use willpower to avoid eating badly has not yet mastered his relationship with food. He is still in combat with it. The man who has to fight himself to get up in the morning has not yet built the kata that makes rising easy. Mastery is not the presence of struggle. Mastery is the transformation of struggle into structure, and structure eventually into nature. The goal is not to white-knuckle your way through life. The goal is to become the kind of person for whom certain things are simply not in question. Final principle of the Dokodo, Musashi's 21 rules written 9 days before his death, is this: do not fear death. For a man who had survived 60 duels, this might seem like the simplest of the rules to arrive at. In fact, it is the most complex, because what Musashi meant by death was not merely the physical ending of a life. He meant all endings: the death of a comfortable habit that no longer serves, the death of the version of yourself that you have outgrown, the death of the excuse that has protected you from the discomfort of growth, the death of the automatic self that has been governing your life without your consent. These are small deaths. They are daily deaths. And the man who fears them will never live fully, because he will spend all of his available life protecting what he is at the expense of what he could become. Self-mastery is not a project with a completion date. It is not a destination at which a sufficiently disciplined person eventually arrives. It is a gate, and the ancient Japanese understood that the gate was always open. It did not require a specific set of circumstances to enter. It did not require a crisis to make it necessary, or a triumph to make it feel earned. It was open every morning when you woke. It was open in every conversation, in every meal, in every moment between impulse and action. The gate was always there. The only thing required to walk through it was the willingness to notice it, and then to walk through it again and again and again, because self-mastery is not a single crossing. It is the daily, quiet, serious practice of choosing who you are over who your habits have decided you should be. Musashi died at the age of 61, alone in his cave, having written his wisdom into texts that would endure for 400 years. He did not die famous in the way that modern culture makes men famous. He died in the possession of himself, which is the only possession the ancient Japanese considered worth having, because a man who possesses the world and does not possess himself owns nothing of any real value. And a man who possesses nothing but himself, who has learned to govern the territory between his ears and behind his ribs, who can sit in stillness while the storm moves through him and remain. This man is, in the deepest and most enduring sense, free. Not free from difficulty, free within it. Not free from himself, free through himself. This is what the samurai knew. This is what Musashi demonstrated with his life. And this is what is available to any man or woman willing to begin the only battle that has ever truly mattered. The quiet, lifelong, unglamorous, irreplaceable campaign to become the master of oneself. Begin there. begin only there. And everything else will follow.